A janitor in a discount suit doesn't belong at my Christmas table, my ex-husband Richard said loudly enough for every guest to hear. And when my children laughed with him, I felt something inside my chest go very still. The dining room at Olivia's house glowed with soft golden Christmas lights and expensive candles that smelled like cinnamon and pine. Snow drifted gently outside the giant windows overlooking the frozen lake, and holiday music played quietly through hidden speakers in the ceiling. Everything looked beautiful, perfect even. But the moment Richard lifted his wine glass and smirked at the man sitting beside me, the warmth disappeared from the room entirely. Thomas simply smiled. That was the strange part. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't argue. He just folded his hands calmly beside his plate as though Richard's words had bounced harmlessly off him. I wish I'd had that kind of composure. At 67 years old, I still felt my face burn like a humiliated teenager whenever my family decided I wasn't enough. "Dad, stop," my daughter Olivia said between nervous laughter, though she was smiling too. "You're going to make things awkward." "Awkward?" Richard chuckled as he carved another slice of rosemary ham. "Your mother brought a school janitor to Christmas dinner wearing a jacket from Goodwill. I think awkward already arrived." Brandon nearly choked on his drink laughing. My own son. The little boy I used to rock to sleep after thunderstorms. The same boy who once cried because he thought monsters lived under his bed. Now he sat across from me in a tailored cashmere sweater, grinning at his father while they mocked the man I loved. I tightened my grip around my wine glass and stared down at the reflection of the Christmas lights trembling against the dark red liquid. I told myself not to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. Richard leaned back in his chair with that familiar look of superiority that had poisoned most of our 32-year marriage. Even after 5 years divorced, he still knew exactly how to make me feel small. "So tell me, Tom," he said slowly, "how many mops does a man need to own before he proposes?" A few guests laughed. Quietly. I recognized that kind of laugh. The uncomfortable kind people use when they want to stay on the side of power. Thomas dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin before answering. "Only one if you take care of it properly." Brandon burst out laughing again. Olivia shook her head. "Mom, seriously," she muttered. "You could have done better than this." That sentence hurt more than all the others. Because for a second, I heard the truth hiding underneath it. They were embarrassed by me. Not because I was cruel, not because I was selfish, but because after my divorce, after all the country clubs and charity dinners and polished appearances Richard had built his life around, I had fallen in love with a quiet man who worked nights cleaning floors at a private academy. Thomas reached under the table and gently touched my hand. Just once. Soft and steady. The way he always did whenever he sensed I was retreating inside myself. It amazed me how such a simple gesture could feel more comforting than the entire second half of my marriage. Richard noticed it too. "Careful, Evelyn," he said with a grin. "That's probably the same hand he uses to unclog toilets." More laughter. I heard it echo through the room while heat rushed into my face. For one terrible moment, I regretted bringing Thomas here at all. Maybe Olivia had been right weeks ago when she called me privately and suggested I avoid making Christmas uncomfortable. At the time, I thought she meant tension between Richard and me. Now I understood what she really meant. She didn't want people seeing her mother with a janitor. Thomas slowly lifted his eyes toward Richard then. Calm, relaxed, almost amused. "You know," he said softly, "people usually reveal more about themselves than others when they speak with that much contempt." The room went silent for half a second. Richard's smile stiffened. Brandon looked uncomfortable for the first time all evening. But then Richard laughed again and raised his glass toward the guests. "Listen to him," he said. "The janitor thinks he's a philosopher now." Thomas smiled once more. A small smile. Patient. Almost knowing. Then he glanced briefly at the expensive grandfather clock. Near the fireplace before taking another sip of water, and for the first time that night, I had the strange feeling that my ex-husband had just made a very expensive mistake. I excused myself from the dining room a few minutes later under the pretense of checking the pie in the kitchen, but the truth was I needed a moment where nobody was looking at me with pity or amusement. The kitchen smelled like butter, cinnamon, and roasted pecans, but even those comforting scents could not settle the ache spreading through my chest. I stood quietly beside the marble counter and stared out the window above the sink where snowflakes drifted beneath the porch lights like tiny pieces of torn paper floating through the dark. 5 years ago, I would have still been hosting Christmas dinners myself. Richard loved making a spectacle of success back then. Caterers, imported wine, crystal decorations flown in from Europe. Every holiday had felt more like a performance than a family gathering. I used to spend entire weeks preparing the house, so everything would appear flawless to his business friends. Perfect table settings, perfect clothes, perfect children, perfect marriage. And somehow, despite all my effort, I was always the one made to feel inadequate. Too emotional, too quiet, too soft. Richard had a talent for making criticism sound sophisticated. He never shouted. That would have been easier to survive. Instead, he smiled while slowly convincing you that your feelings were inconvenient little flaws that needed polishing away. By the end of our marriage, I felt less like a wife and more like decorative furniture sitting politely beside him at charity galas. The strange thing was our children slowly learned to speak the same language. Olivia became obsessed with appearances before she turned 25. Brandon worshipped success the way other people worshipped religion. Somewhere along the way, kindness became embarrassing to them. Warmth became weakness. I heard laughter echo from the dining room again and closed my eyes briefly. I knew they were still talking about Thomas. Maybe about his suit. Maybe about his job. Maybe about me. A few years ago, those conversations would have broken me completely. But Thomas had changed something inside me without ever trying to. I met him 2 winters after the divorce at St. Catherine's Medical Center while visiting a friend recovering from surgery. I still remember seeing him late one evening, quietly polishing the hallway floors near the cardiac wing, while most people rushed past him without even making eye contact. An elderly woman dropped her grocery bag near the elevators, and before I could move, Thomas was already kneeling to help her gather cans of soup rolling across the tile floor. He spoke to her gently, patiently, like she mattered. That stayed with me. Weeks later, I saw him again in the hospital cafeteria drinking black coffee alone while reading a worn paperback novel. We started talking by accident, then intentionally. There was no performance with him, no competition, no need to impress anyone. When Thomas asked me to dinner for the first time, he chose a tiny Italian restaurant with faded red booths and string lights hanging in the windows year-round. He apologized because he could not afford somewhere more elegant. I remember laughing softly and telling him it was the nicest evening I had experienced in years. And it was true. He listened when I spoke. Really listened. Not while checking his phone. Not while waiting for his turn to talk. He made ordinary moments feel peaceful in a way wealth never had. "You okay?" Thomas asked quietly behind me. I turned and saw him standing in the kitchen doorway holding his untouched water glass. The soft yellow light above the stove reflected against his silver hair. Even now, after everything that happened in that dining room, he looked calm, steady. I forced a small smile. I forgot how exhausting my family can be during the holidays. He stepped closer slowly. "Evelyn," he said gently, "people who measure human value by status usually reveal how empty they are inside." I let out a quiet breath and looked down at my hands. "I am sorry they treated you that way." Thomas smiled faintly. "I am not." That answer surprised me enough to look back up at him. There was something unusual in his expression then. Something patient. Almost thoughtful. Like a man waiting for the right moment to arrive. We returned to the dining room a few minutes later, and the atmosphere had changed in that strange way rooms sometimes do after people have spent several minutes whispering about you while pretending not to. Conversations softened when Thomas and I walked back in. Olivia suddenly became very interested in rearranging silverware near the dessert plates. Brandon avoided eye contact completely while scrolling through his phone. Richard, however, looked perfectly comfortable. He always did after hurting someone. That was one of the things I used to hate most about him. Cruelty never disturbed his appetite. "There they are," he said cheerfully as though the last 20 minutes had been perfectly pleasant. "We were just discussing New Year vacations. Although I suppose public school janitors do not exactly get holiday bonuses." Thomas sat down beside me again without reacting. "You would be surprised how generous life can be," he replied calmly. Richard smirked and took another sip of bourbon. "Not in that profession." Before Thomas could answer, the front door opened somewhere down the hallway, letting in a gust of cold winter air along with the sound of unfamiliar voices. Olivia frowned slightly. "Did somebody invite more guests?" she asked. A moment later, her husband Daniel entered the dining room looking tense. "Richard," he said quietly, "there is someone here asking for Mr. Reed." The room went still. Richard blinked once. Mr. Reed. Daniel nodded awkwardly before stepping aside as a tall man in a dark wool coat entered the dining room, carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. Snow melted slowly from the shoulders of his coat onto the hardwood floor. He looked expensive in the polished, understated way wealthy men often do without trying. The stranger scanned the room before his eyes landed directly on Thomas. Relief crossed his face instantly. "There you are," he said. "I have been trying to reach you for nearly an hour." Thomas sighed softly beside me. "I turned my phone off for Christmas dinner." The man smiled politely. "The board meeting in Boston ended earlier than expected. They need your final approval before midnight." Nobody at the table spoke. I could feel Olivia staring at Thomas beside me while Brandon slowly lowered his phone onto the table. Richard forced out a laugh. "I think you have the wrong person." The stranger looked confused for a second before turning back toward Thomas. "I apologize for interrupting your evening, Mr. Reed, but the acquisition paperwork cannot move forward without your signature." Acquisition. The word landed heavily in the center of the room. Richard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "What acquisition?" he asked carefully. Thomas remained calm. "Tonight is Christmas, Richard." "What acquisition?" Richard repeated louder this time. The man with the portfolio glanced uncertainly between them before answering. "Hawthorne Capital finalized the majority purchase agreement for Carter Hospitality Group this evening." My stomach tightened instantly. Carter Hospitality Group was Richard's company. The business he spent 40 years building. The company he worshipped more faithfully than his own family. Richard stared at the stranger without blinking. "That is impossible," he said quietly. "The buyer has not been publicly disclosed yet." The man looked genuinely confused now. "I assumed everyone here already knew Mr. Reed was leading the acquisition." Silence swallowed the room whole. I slowly turned toward Thomas beside me, but he did not look triumphant. He did not look angry either. If anything, he looked tired, like a man who had hoped this moment could wait until after dessert. Richard laughed suddenly, but the sound came out strained and hollow. "This is some kind of joke." Thomas folded his napkin carefully beside his plate before finally speaking. "No," he said softly. "It is business." Brandon looked pale now. Olivia's mouth parted slightly in shock. Across the table, Richard's confident posture began to collapse inch by inch beneath the weight of something he clearly had not expected. And for the first time all evening, nobody in that room was laughing anymore. Richard stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the dining room. His face had lost all color now. The confident holiday host who spent the entire evening mocking Thomas suddenly looked like a man struggling to understand how the ground beneath him had disappeared. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "My company is not for sale." The man holding the portfolio shifted uncomfortably. "Respectfully, sir, your board approved the emergency restructuring terms last week." Richard stared at him in disbelief. "Without my authorization?" "You authorized contingency negotiations after the third quarter losses," the man replied carefully. "The lenders accelerated repayment conditions after the December audit." Olivia looked confused. "Dad, what is he talking about?" Richard ignored her completely. His eyes remained locked on Thomas now. "You knew," he said quietly. Thomas met his stare without arrogance. "Yes. And you sat here all evening pretending to be some maintenance worker while my family." Richard stopped himself suddenly, realizing too late where that sentence was going. Thomas glanced briefly at the untouched dessert table glowing beneath soft Christmas lights. "I never pretended to be anything," he said calmly. "I do work maintenance at St. Catherine's 3 nights a week." Brandon frowned. "But why would someone with billions of dollars clean hospital floors?" Thomas looked toward him with surprising gentleness. "Because after my wife died 6 years ago, I discovered I no longer cared about boardrooms or private jets very much. But hospitals," he paused briefly. "Hospitals remind people what actually matters." Nobody spoke after that. Snow continued falling quietly outside the windows while the fireplace crackled softly against the awful tension swallowing the room. I looked at Thomas beside me and suddenly remembered all the little things I had never questioned properly. The old pickup truck he drove, even though he could clearly afford more. The way restaurant managers always seemed nervous when they recognized him. The expensive watch he never talked about. The phone calls he stepped outside to take late at night. He had hidden none of it. I had simply never imagined looking deeper because he never acted like a wealthy man. Richard let out a bitter laugh. So this was revenge. Thomas shook his head immediately. No, you expect me to believe that? Richard demanded. You humiliate me in front of my own family on Christmas Eve and call it coincidence. Richard, Thomas said quietly. You humiliated yourself long before I arrived. The room went silent again. Olivia looked down at her plate, while Brandon slowly rubbed a hand across his jaw, as though trying to wake himself from a bad dream. I realized then that this was the first time in their adult lives they had ever seen someone stand calmly in front of their father without fearing him. Richard built his entire identity around intimidation, around status, around making other people feel smaller so he could feel larger. But none of those tools worked on Thomas. You manipulated Evelyn, Richard muttered. You let her think you were human? Thomas interrupted softly. Ordinary. Richard said nothing. Thomas folded his hands together on the table. Your problem is that you believe kindness only exists in people without power. You spent so many years chasing status that you forgot how to recognize character. I felt tears sting my eyes then, but not from humiliation this time. Something else. Something warmer. Because for years after my divorce, Richard had convinced me that I was difficult to love unless I performed perfectly. Thin enough, elegant enough, quiet enough, impressive enough. But Thomas never asked me to perform anything. He simply loved me exactly as I was. Olivia finally looked up at me then. Mom, she said softly, her voice filled with shame now. Why did you never tell us? I stared at her for a long moment before answering. Because unlike this family, I said quietly, he never believed money was the most important thing about him. Across the table, Richard lowered himself slowly back into his chair, while the Christmas lights reflected weakly against the untouched bourbon sitting beside his hand. For the first time in nearly 40 years, he looked old to me. The rest of the dinner unraveled slowly after that, like expensive fabric coming apart at the seams. Nobody seemed to know how to behave anymore. The polished confidence that usually filled Olivia's dining room had vanished completely, replaced by awkward silences and forced smiles that looked painful to maintain. Even the Christmas music drifting softly from the speakers sounded strange now, too cheerful for the heaviness sitting at that table. Richard remained unusually quiet beside his untouched drink. Every few minutes, he glanced toward Thomas as though trying to solve a puzzle that refused to make sense. I knew that look well. Richard could tolerate failure. He could tolerate competition. But he could never tolerate being wrong about someone, especially not publicly. Olivia finally stood and began clearing dessert plates with trembling hands. Does anybody want coffee? She asked too quickly. Nobody answered immediately. Brandon stared down at the table while rubbing the back of his neck. His wife Melissa sat unusually still beside him, avoiding everyone's eyes completely. Thomas looked toward Olivia gently. Coffee would be lovely. Thank you. She nodded almost gratefully and disappeared into the kitchen. It struck me then how strange this evening must have felt for my children. Their entire understanding of success had always been built around appearances. Expensive cars, vacation homes, country club memberships, designer labels. Richard taught them that respectable people looked wealthy at all times. Thomas had shattered that illusion simply by existing. Why did you keep it secret? Brandon asked suddenly. His voice sounded smaller than usual now. Thomas leaned back slightly in his chair. Because people behave more honestly when they think you have nothing to offer them. Brandon lowered his eyes immediately after hearing that answer. The truth inside those words landed hard at that table. Too hard. I remembered all the birthdays Brandon forgot after the divorce. All the holidays Olivia shortened because Richard's new social circle had more important parties to attend. They had not abandoned me completely. That would have been easier to confront. Instead, they reduced me slowly, quietly. Like I had become an obligation they needed to manage politely between vacations and business dinners. And because Thomas appeared ordinary, they dismissed him before even learning who he was. You made fools out of us, Richard muttered finally. Thomas shook his head calmly. No, Richard. I gave you every opportunity to behave with decency. Silence again. Heavy this time. Honest. Olivia returned carrying a silver tray with coffee cups that rattled softly against the saucers because her hands were still shaking. I watched her carefully as she placed a cup in front of Thomas without meeting his eyes. I am sorry, she whispered quietly. Thomas looked up at her with kindness that surprised even me. Thank you. That simple response nearly broke something inside her. I saw it immediately in the way her expression collapsed for half a second before she turned away quickly toward the kitchen again. Richard suddenly stood and walked toward the large windows overlooking the snowy backyard. His reflection stared back at him against the dark glass. Older now. Smaller somehow. You could destroy everything I built, he said quietly without turning around. Thomas took a slow sip of coffee before answering. Your company was already collapsing before I became involved. Then why buy it? Richard demanded bitterly. Thomas looked toward the fireplace for a moment before speaking. Because 7,000 employees deserve leadership that values people more than appearances. Richard laughed softly under his breath, but there was no confidence left in it now. Only exhaustion. I studied the man I spent most of my adult life trying desperately to please and realized something strange. He no longer intimidated me. Not even a little. Maybe because for the first time, I was seeing him without the armor of money and status protecting him. Underneath all of it was simply a frightened, aging man terrified of losing control. Thomas reached for my hand beneath the table again, and this time I held onto his tightly. Warmth spread slowly through my chest while snow continued falling beyond the windows in soft white silence. Across the room, Richard finally turned back toward us. His eyes settled on our joined hands before lowering quietly to the floor. And in that moment, I realized something I should have understood years ago. The strongest person in that house had been the man everyone laughed at when he first walked through the door. An hour later, the dining room looked like the aftermath of a storm nobody expected to survive. Half-finished coffee cups sat cold beside untouched slices of pecan pie. Candle wax had melted unevenly across the center of the table, and outside the windows the snowfall had thickened into heavy white curtains swallowing the lake completely. Nobody wanted to admit the evening was ruined, but everyone felt it. The old balance in this family had cracked beyond repair. Melissa quietly gathered empty dessert plates, while Brandon followed her into the kitchen without speaking much. Olivia sat near the fireplace pretending to scroll through her phone even though the screen had gone dark several minutes earlier. Every now and then, her eyes drifted toward Thomas with the unsettled expression of someone reevaluating every assumption they had made about another human being. Richard remained standing by the windows, nursing the same untouched glass of bourbon. He looked trapped inside his own thoughts now. Smaller somehow. I had spent decades believing my ex-husband controlled every room he entered, but tonight I realized how fragile that control truly was. It only existed when people admired him. Fear and admiration were the fuel he lived on. Without them, there was not much left underneath. Thomas excused himself briefly to take a phone call in the hallway, leaving me alone near the fireplace while soft Christmas music drifted quietly through the room again. Olivia finally approached me after several long minutes of hesitation. "Mom," she said softly, sitting beside me on the couch. "Why did you never tell us who he really was?" I stared into the fire for a moment before answering. Because that was never the important part. She looked down at her hands immediately. "I feel terrible." There was genuine pain in her voice now. Not embarrassment. Not social discomfort. Actual shame. I had waited years to hear that tone from one of my children. "When you brought him to Thanksgiving last year," she whispered. Slowly. I remember Brandon joking that he probably parked cars before becoming a janitor. Her voice cracked slightly, and Thomas just smiled and asked if the turkey needed carving. I nodded quietly because I remembered that too. I remembered every moment my children reduced him to a stereotype, while he continued treating them with kindness anyway. Olivia wiped at her eyes quickly before speaking again. Why would someone like him even want to be with us after tonight? That question hurt more than she probably realized. Because hidden underneath, it was another truth. My children genuinely believed wealthy people only associated with others who offered status in return. They had inherited Richard's transactional view of love without ever noticing it. "Thomas does not measure people by their worst moments," I said quietly. Olivia let out a shaky breath and leaned back against the couch cushions. "Dad does." I did not answer because we both already knew it was true. Across the room, Richard suddenly spoke without turning around. "You think I am the villain now?" His voice sounded tired, older than I had ever heard it before. I watched snow slide slowly down the dark glass behind him before replying carefully. "I think you spent so many years teaching our children to admire success that they forgot how to recognize goodness." Richard closed his eyes briefly at those words. For a second, he looked genuinely wounded. I built everything for this family, he said quietly. Everything. No, I replied softly. You built an image. Silence settled heavily over the room again. Then Thomas returned from the hallway carrying himself with the same calm steadiness he had maintained all evening. He crossed the room and sat beside me once more, resting one hand gently against my shoulder. Such a small gesture. Yet somehow it made the entire house feel warmer. Richard looked toward him carefully. What happens now? He asked. Thomas considered the question for a moment before answering. Your company keeps operating. Employees keep their pensions. The hotels remain open. The board stabilizes the debt structure over the next 18 months. Richard frowned slightly. And me? Thomas met his eyes evenly. That depends on whether you still know how to lead people without humiliating them. Nobody spoke after that. The fireplace crackled softly while Christmas lights shimmered against the polished walls. Somewhere upstairs, one of Olivia's children laughed in their sleep through a baby monitor left on low volume in the kitchen. Life continuing quietly in the background while everything important changed downstairs. I leaned gently against Thomas then and realized something that filled me with unexpected peace. For years after my divorce, I thought losing Richard had destroyed my life. But sitting there beside the man everyone mocked only hours earlier, I finally understood the truth. Losing Richard was the first honest thing that ever happened to me. Close to midnight, the storm outside had grown so heavy that nobody could leave safely yet. Snow buried the driveway in thick white layers while icy wind rattled softly against the windows. Olivia spread blankets across the downstairs couches for anyone staying overnight, but the warmth of holiday hospitality still felt fragile after everything that happened. People moved carefully around each other now, speaking in softer voices, avoiding sudden laughter as though the house itself had become aware of uncomfortable truths. Thomas stood near the fireplace, helping Daniel stack fresh logs, while Brandon quietly cleared glasses from the dining room table without being asked for the first time in years. The change in my son unsettled me almost as much as the earlier cruelty. Shame had softened him quickly, perhaps too quickly. I sat alone for a moment near the Christmas tree, watching colored lights flicker against wrapped presents still untouched beneath the branches. Earlier that evening, I had felt invisible in this house. Now everyone seemed hyper-aware of my presence. Funny how rapidly people adjusted their respect once money entered the conversation. That realization left a bitter ache inside me despite everything Thomas had revealed. Olivia approached slowly, carrying 2 mugs of tea. Chamomile, she said quietly while handing one to me. The kind you used to make when I could not sleep. As a kid, I accepted the mug carefully. The familiar scent instantly pulled me backward through decades of memories. Fevers, nightmares, school anxiety, long nights sitting beside my children while Richard traveled for work and called home mostly to discuss schedules and appearances. I was the one who stayed. The one who remembered doctor appointments and favorite bedtime stories and science projects due on Fridays. Yet somehow, after the divorce, I became the disposable parent. Easier to overlook. Easier to embarrass. Olivia sat beside me slowly. Mom, she whispered, did you hate us tonight? The question startled me. I looked toward her and saw genuine fear hiding behind her carefully controlled expression. Fear that perhaps she had damaged something beyond repair. I thought carefully before answering because the truth mattered now more than ever. No, I said softly. But I was disappointed in the people you became for a while. Tears gathered instantly in her eyes. We thought. She stopped herself and looked down. We thought success looked a certain way. I nodded slowly. I know. Across the room, Thomas laughed quietly at something Daniel said while helping adjust the fireplace screen. Such an ordinary sound. Warm. Unforced. The kind of laugh that never existed during my marriage to Richard because everything around Richard eventually became performance. Dad always said people without ambition settle for simple lives, Olivia whispered. And tonight, I realized Thomas probably had more self-confidence cleaning hospital floors than Dad ever had running a corporation. I could not help smiling faintly at that because it was true. Thomas never needed admiration to feel valuable. Richard depended on it completely. At that exact moment, Richard entered the room again after taking a long phone call upstairs. His shoulders looked heavier now, the exhaustion finally visible beneath decades of polished control. He stopped near the tree and looked around quietly at his family gathered throughout the room. Nobody rushed toward him anymore. Nobody waited anxiously for his approval. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Power had left him somehow. Not because he lost money. Because people finally saw him clearly. Richard looked toward me carefully. "Can we talk?" he asked. The old version of me would have followed immediately, eager to keep peace at any cost. But tonight, I simply nodded toward the empty armchair across from mine. "You can talk here." He hesitated briefly before sitting down. The firelight reflected against his tired face, while Christmas ornaments shimmered softly behind him. "I did not realize how much damage I caused," he admitted quietly. "Those words alone would have been unimaginable years ago." Richard never apologized. Not sincerely. "You taught our children to value status above kindness," I replied softly. "And they learned the lesson well." He lowered his eyes. "I thought I was preparing them for the world." "No," I said gently. "You were preparing them to fear judgment." Silence settled between us while snow continued falling beyond the windows. Finally, Richard looked toward Thomas near the fireplace. "He really loves you," he said quietly. I followed his gaze toward the man who spent the evening enduring humiliation without once humiliating anyone in return. "Yes," I answered softly. "And he never needed me to become smaller in order to feel important." Richard closed his eyes briefly after hearing that. For the first time since I met him at 22 years old, he had no clever response. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the storm still had not eased. Thick snow covered the backyard completely now, transforming the lake beyond the windows into a pale frozen blur beneath the moonlight. Olivia had finally convinced everyone to stay the night rather than risk driving on icy roads, so the house settled into an uneasy quiet filled with soft footsteps, creaking floorboards, and the occasional hiss from the fireplace downstairs. I could not sleep. Too much had changed in a single evening. I stood alone in the kitchen wearing one of Olivia's oversized sweaters while reheating leftover coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. The digital clock on the stove glowed blue against the darkness. Somewhere upstairs, pipes shifted softly behind the walls. It felt strange being awake inside my daughter's house. After all these years of emotional distance between us. Strange and sad. Could not sleep either? Brandon's voice asked quietly behind me. I turned and saw my son standing barefoot near the doorway, his hair messy from sleep, looking suddenly much younger than 42 years old. For a moment, I saw traces of the little boy who used to sneak downstairs for hot chocolate during thunderstorms. I nodded toward the coffee pot. "There is some left if you want it." He stepped into the kitchen slowly and leaned against the counter while I poured another mug. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence between us felt delicate. Not hostile anymore. Just fragile. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. His voice sounded rough with exhaustion. "Not because Thomas is rich. I mean, that is part of it, obviously." He gave a weak, embarrassed laugh before shaking his head. "But tonight made me realize how badly I have treated you for years." I handed him the coffee mug quietly. "What changed?" Brandon stared down into the dark coffee for several seconds before answering. "Dad always made it seem normal. The jokes, the criticism, looking down on people." He swallowed hard. "And I copied him because I thought that was strength." The honesty in his voice hurt more than denial would have. Because deep down, I already knew it was true. Children absorb emotional habits the same way they absorb language. Richard mocked weakness constantly throughout our marriage. Waiters, receptionists, neighbors with smaller homes. He treated compassion like a personality flaw. Over time, our children learned that respect should always flow upward toward wealth and status instead of outward toward humanity. Brandon rubbed one hand across his face tiredly. "Do you know the worst part?" he asked quietly. "When Dad started making fun of Thomas tonight, I joined in automatically. I did not even think about it. It was just instinct." I looked at my son carefully then. Shame sat heavily across his expression now, but underneath it, I also saw something else beginning to form. Awareness. Genuine awareness for the first time in years. "You can unlearn things," I said softly. Brandon nodded slowly, though. He still looked unconvinced. "Thomas probably hates me." "No," I replied immediately. "That is one of the reasons this hurts so much. He does not hate easily." Brandon stared quietly into his coffee after hearing that. Upstairs, I heard soft footsteps moving across the hallway floor before the staircase creaked gently. A few seconds later, Thomas appeared wearing a gray sweater and reading glasses, looking half awake but peaceful. "I wondered where you disappeared to," he said warmly when he saw me. Brandon straightened awkwardly beside the counter. "I was apologizing," he admitted quietly. Thomas studied him for a brief moment before walking farther into the kitchen. "That takes courage," he said simply. Brandon blinked in surprise, probably expecting coldness instead. Thomas opened the refrigerator and pulled out a small plate covered with foil. "Your daughter told me there is leftover apple pie hidden in here somewhere," he said while peering onto the shelves. The normalcy of that moment nearly made me laugh. After everything that happened tonight, after billion-dollar acquisitions and shattered family illusions, this man was wandering through a kitchen at 2 in the morning looking for pie. Brandon actually smiled faintly for the first time all evening. "Top shelf," he muttered. Thomas found the pie triumphantly and held it up like a prize. "Excellent," he declared softly. "Nothing heals dysfunctional Christmas dinners faster than sugar." Brandon laughed quietly under his breath then, and the sound startled all three of us because it felt genuine. Small. Human. Not polished or performative. Just real. I watched the two men standing together beneath the dim kitchen lights while snow continued falling outside and realized something extraordinary had happened inside this house tonight. The richest person here was not the man who owned the company. It was the man capable of making other people feel safe enough to become better versions of themselves. The storm finally ended sometime just before dawn. When I opened my eyes the next morning, pale winter sunlight was spilling softly across the guest room walls, turning the snow outside into sheets of silver and gold. For a few quiet seconds, I forgot everything that had happened the night before. Then the memories returned all at once. The dinner table, Richard's laughter, Thomas sitting calmly through humiliation that would have shattered most people. The silence after everyone discovered who he truly was. I lay still beneath the heavy blanket listening to the peaceful sounds of the house waking slowly downstairs. Coffee brewing. Cabinet doors opening softly. Children whispering somewhere in the hallway. Christmas morning. Strange how life continues moving forward even after entire emotional worlds collapse overnight. When I walked downstairs, the atmosphere felt completely different from the evening before. Softer. Honest somehow. The sharp edges had disappeared. Olivia stood near the kitchen island wearing slippers and an oversized sweatshirt while helping her youngest daughter open a toy kitchen set beside the Christmas tree. Brandon was making pancakes while Melissa laughed quietly beside him. Nobody seemed polished anymore. Nobody seemed interested in pretending. Thomas stood near the window pouring coffee into 2 mugs when he saw me enter. His face warmed instantly. "Good morning," he said softly. Such simple words. Yet after years of emotionally complicated holidays, hearing genuine warmth directed toward me still felt almost unfamiliar. Richard sat alone at the far end of the dining table, staring into a cup of black coffee. He looked like he had barely slept. The expensive confidence he carried for decades was gone now, stripped away sometime during the long snowy night. For the first time since our divorce, he looked less like a powerful businessman and more like an aging man confronting himself honestly. Olivia approached me carefully while the children played nearby. "Mom," she said quietly, "we were thinking maybe everyone could stay for brunch before driving home." I studied her expression for a moment. No performance, no obligation, just sincerity. "I would like that," I answered softly. Relief crossed her face immediately. Thomas handed me a warm coffee mug before leaning close enough for only me to hear. "Your family is trying." I looked around the room again. Brandon flipping pancakes badly while Melissa laughed at him. Olivia untangling Christmas lights from the toy kitchen. Richard sitting silently with regret written all over his face. Trying. Yes, maybe they finally were. Breakfast passed quietly at first. Not awkward this time. Thoughtful. Careful. Like everyone understood how fragile honesty could be after years of avoiding it. Then, halfway through brunch, Richard slowly set down his fork and cleared his throat. The room fell silent almost immediately. "I owe everyone here an apology," he said quietly. Even the children looked up in surprise. Richard Carter did not apologize. Not publicly. Not sincerely. Yet here he sat on Christmas morning with trembling hands and tired eyes speaking more honestly than I had heard in 40 years. "I spent most of my life believing success gave me the right to judge people," he admitted. "And somewhere along the way, I taught my children to do the same." Olivia lowered her eyes instantly. Brandon stared down at his plate. Richard looked toward Thomas then. What I said to you last night was cruel and unnecessary. Thomas nodded once. Thank you. No lecture. No revenge. Just grace. Richard let out a long breath before finally turning toward me. I was not a very good husband to you, Evelyn. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes then because I had waited decades to hear those words. Not because I needed validation anymore, but because part of me once believed I imagined all the loneliness myself. Richard shook his head slowly. You spent years making our family feel warm while I focused on appearances. His voice weakened slightly, and I think I forgot warmth matters more. Nobody spoke after that. The Christmas tree lights flickered softly beside the windows while snow sparkled outside beneath the bright morning sun. Then Thomas reached over and gently took my hand beneath the table exactly the way he always did. Steady, quiet, certain. I looked down at our joined hands and suddenly realized something extraordinary. The greatest gift I received that Christmas had nothing to do with wealth or revenge or humiliation. It was clarity. Richard spent 40 years teaching everyone to admire power, but Thomas taught them something far more valuable in a single night. A person's worth has absolutely nothing to do with how impressive they appear when they walk into a room. It has everything to do with how safe people feel after they sit beside them. And for the first time in my life, sitting there surrounded by the family that once made me feel invisible, I no longer felt small at all.